beg your pardon, but that's not something a maester should say.
Then pretend I didn't say it.
You've probably seen the Antichrist in a lot of stories before. Now get ready to meet the Anti-Buddha. In order to understand Seymour, you need to understand the environment he grew up in. Seymour lives in the world of Spira, which is plagued by a being known as Sin that keeps technological progress at a standstill by laying waste to entire cities, and can only be put down temporarily before it resumes its rampage. As such, Spira's civilization is trapped in an endless circle of death without an end in sight. Seymour is a hybrid between a human and a guado, who are basically tree people, who was forced into hiding along with his mother because people couldn't accept their union. When Seymour's mother died and he was saddled with the responsibility to give his life on behalf of the people who rejected him, he eventually decided that life in Spira was nothing more than an endless cycle of suffering with no end, and the only release from that pain is death. So instead, he became a part of the clergy of the Church of Yevon to eventually find a way to gain control of Sin and put the whole world out of its misery. Seymour is incredibly nihilistic, even by Final Fantasy villain standards. Given his background and the environment Final Fantasy X takes place in, you can easily see his point of view and how he could come to the conclusion he did. In any other story, his ramblings about Death's sweet release would be crazy rambling, and it is, but in the context of Final Fantasy X, it isn't hard to see his point of view and sympathize to a degree. Another thing this guy has going for him are the many different varied battles against him. You fight him 4 times throughout the game, and all of them are stiff challenges that take full advantage of every aspect of the game's battle system. In the first fight against him, he summons Anima, a huge, scary summoned monster that you saw before in cutscene and know just how powerful it is as it laid waste to an entire swarm of monsters, and to see it summoned against you is a huge wake-up call. The second fight is even more challenging and takes place in a critical turning point for the story. The third fight is utterly brutal, with an attack that zombifies the main characters so that healing spells will hurt them, and a moveset that takes full advantage of that fact. And the fourth fight is actually kind of a pushover, but at least the music slaps. You've been hearing that music through the entire video, by the way. The interesting thing about all these fights is that you actually do kill him after the first one, but later on he comes back as an unsent, basically a solid ghost that can't move on because they have unfinished business or died an unclean death. Not only that, but his death actually has a huge impact on the story. The heroes actually fight and kill him after finding out he was responsible for the death of his father, and wind up becoming fugitives as a result. The ironic thing is that even though his death has a huge impact on the story, even though he does come back, he might as well have died for how much he impacted the plot. I'm serious, after his death, he does pretty much nothing. Seymour only really sticks around because he's the character who best fills the traditional Final Fantasy villain role. And then there's his design. I mean, just look at him. Those hair antlers, that open-chested robe. I can hardly take him seriously as a villain because of just how silly he looks. Doesn't really help that his English voice sounds an awful lot like Winnie the Pooh.
I proposed to Lady Yuna as a maester of Yevon.
It's more friendly with 2.
I joke, but I really do like Seymour as a villain in spite of his failings. I mean, sure, his design is kind of laughable and he kind of drops out of the plot towards the end, but in spite of all of that, in his role as a dark reflection of the world the game creates, he does an excellent job.